The Rebel Capitalist Show. All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone to the Rebel Capitalist Show that I've really looked forward to speaking with. He has a book that is pretty much famous throughout FinTwit and the United States. And I know so many hedge fund managers that swear by this book, and it's absolutely fantastic. The Fourth Turning. Neil Howe, welcome to the Rebel Capitalist Show, my friend.
Hey, George. Great to be here.
So I think most of my viewers have read your book, but for those who might have not, can you just give us a short summary of it, and then we'll dive into some questions that I think are very relevant to what we're seeing today in the world.
Yeah, great. And maybe I should add that I'm, for everyone who has read or familiar with The Fourth Turning, I'm doing a new book. So that'll be sort of updating it and telling us where we are now. The Fourth Turning was written in 1997. So my God, I hate to think of how old that is, right? That's a generation ago, right?
Yeah.
So it was the second or third or fourth book, actually, in a number of books that I wrote with Bill Strauss back starting really in the late 1980s on generations and American history. We wrote a book in 1991 called Generations, the History of America's Future, which is actually a history of the United States, history of America, really from the early 17th century on, told as a sequence of generational biographies. And one of the things we found out is that generations have always been very different from each other, even back then, right? And we see many of the same generational contrasts. In fact, these generational contrasts follow a pattern. They keep coming up time and again. And it's linked to some of the large rhythms we see in American history that many people have, been familiar with over the years. And that is, we seem to encounter these great civic crises about once every long human lifetime, right? You go from the Glorious Revolution, the War of Spanish Succession, a huge event here in the colonies around the 1680s, 1690s. You go forward then to the 1770s, the American Revolution, the founding of the United States. Then you go to the Civil War. Then you go to the New Deal in World War II. And you go ahead another long human life, about 80 or 90 years. And guess what? Here we are today, right? And roughly halfway in between these great civic crises, you have these periods of awakening, these great, huge values upheavals, right? These are the great awakenings in American history. And we number them: First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and most recently the late 60s and 70s, which was a great awakening time, right, in American history. Young people rebelling against the establishment in the name of higher values, right? This classic awakening stuff. And that's a really interesting pattern, isn't it? And we wrote about that in the context of generations. And by the way, in that book is where we coined the name Millennial Generation. If anyone wants to know where that label comes from, it's from that book. And we kind of also sort of, screwed into place some of the other labels we now sometimes use, like Silent Generation, GI Generation, and so on for other generations. So this was really what we worked on for a long time. And then in 1997, we decided to write a similar book, but with the emphasis first on the rhythms of history, rather than on the generations, and that was The Fourth Turning. And we looked ahead. That's a book where we looked ahead explicitly to a crisis era beginning sometime in the middle to late 2000 decade, which turned out to be the global financial crisis, and an era that we expect to last a good generation. So, 22, 23 years, something like that. And so this era will be in for, through the 2020s.
And this era is the Fourth Turning.
Yes, this is the Fourth Turning. We'll possibly be in it to the early, 2030s. And it's a long period, as was, earlier, many of the earlier eras like that we had.
Yeah, and it sounds like the other Fourth Turnings, they end in war. So is that inevitable, or can we avoid that?
Well, it's always been there, but the idea of a civic crisis is kind of part of the dynamic, right? You need creative destruction to bring stuff down and build new things up. And typically people won't build big new things unless they have to. I mean, I have to say it, but that's human nature, right? And that's why we founded the United States with all these new institutions, right? Like, a Senate and a House and a Capitol and, just all these new institutions. We built it because we had torn down the old system, right? We left Britain, but we had nothing really going, right? This very weak confederacy, and we were in chaos in the 1870s, right? Complete anarchy. The whole system was fragmenting, breaking up. So we founded this new powerful central government to keep us together. And that was a great founding civic moment. And we've done things similar to that in the later crises. We come out of that with a renewed understanding of what it means to be America, to be united, what we stand for. And we develop civic instincts of community, which last with us and actually keep the subsequent decades stable again. We're typically very unstable going into a crisis era.
Yeah. So, looking at today's world, there's a lot of social unrest. There's an extreme amount of divisiveness. I think you touched on that many times, and I'd love for you to expand on that. But I look through today's world through the lens of the 1770s and the 1780s. And I've heard you mention several times that back then, if you read people's diaries, they didn't refer to it as the revolution or the Revolutionary War. They referred to it as a civil war. Right. And it's because there were so many people that were loyalists, and then you had the patriots, and they were really divisive. And there was all this kind of guerrilla warfare that we saw between Americans. And when I think about the United States today moving into a civil war, so many people are talking about it. And I don't know if it's a civil war of tanks and bombs and chariots or something like that, but maybe more so of this guerrilla warfare, which we kind of saw in 2020. How do you see that?
Well, it's interesting that all of these crisis eras, particularly near the beginning, are characterized by enormous divisions in society. What happens is the old order becomes ineffective. Right. And then, of course, what happens is you have new people around new ideals building up these ideas of a new order, right? So you have these enormous political realignments, these new coalitions of entirely new parties, typically coming up with an agenda which is mutually exclusive of the other party's agenda, right? So you see early on in crisis eras always an enormous upsurge in polarization, partisanship, engagement. Everyone starts to vote. We've seen that now, right, with the voting rates. So the last two elections have been the highest voting rates in over a century. Everyone now, and all the elections across the United States are all being nationalized. No one cares anymore what's happening in your county. It's all about Trump or Biden, right? It's all a national. Every race is a national race. It could be for your dog catcher. Yeah. It's a national race, right? And I think that is absolutely typical of these periods. It happens every time. And it happened in the early 1770s as well. Suddenly everything was about this ultimate decision of what you were going to do. And the differentiation between revolution and civil war, it's just a word. It all depends on your point of view. And you're right, the loyalists tended to see it more as a civil war. And there were a lot of loyalists. And the patriots like to talk about it as a revolution for obvious reasons. But you see in the Civil War, I mean, was it a rebellion? Was it a civil war? Was it an independence movement? You remember the South, actually, the secessionist states said, this is our 1770. We're declaring our independence from the Union, right? So in other words, it all depends on your point of view. Each party is trying to frame it for them. But all of these eras, go back to the Glorious Revolution, go back earlier in British and English history, right? These were all periods of powerful domestic division based on religion, based on economics, based on your values orientation.
Yeah, Neil, what I've noticed is this over the past couple decades of my life is this move away from religion in the United States. And I'm not here to say religion is good or bad, or anything like that. But the bottom line is people need some sort of meaning in their life. So if they don't have religion, they're going to fill it with something. And it seems as though they might be filling it with their political belief system. So does that exacerbate the problem, the divisiveness? And then when you layer on top of that social media, does that make it even worse?
Yeah, well, that was, Lord Chesterton once said, when people believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything.
Right.
Which is a little bit kind of what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
I do think that religion as, spiritual discovery, that's that quest for meaning, always descends to a low point during crisis eras. The 1930s was a period, there was a common expression used, a depression of religion in America. People weren't coming into churches, and same thing, right? What did the younger generation want? What did the young GI generation coming of age want to do? They were joining socialist clubs. Some of them were joining the communists. I mean, they're joining union movements. They were thinking about how do we physically change the infrastructure of this country, get it moving again. Remember, the rest of the world was either they were rebuilding capitalists, or much of Europe was turning fascist.
Right.
I mean, you remember that was a period when democracy was in decline everywhere in the world. People were thinking about how do we actually create a new material future, because that seemed to be what was in danger. No one was terribly interested in exploring spirituality during that time. Same thing, by the way, was true during the American Revolution. The revolutionary generation was famously secular. You remember the famous comment of Alexander Hamilton when someone told him the Constitution said nothing about God. And he said, "Oh yeah, we forgot." But the point is that that generation was famously disinterested in spirituality. They wanted a machine. They wanted to build a political machine that worked. And they did a pretty good job, I think you'd say, in the end. But whereas in the 1740s, 2 generations earlier, all of the young people in America were obsessed about religion. Of course, that was the Great Awakening. And that generation continued to obsess on religion, even when they got into their 70s, even during the American Revolution. It was the older generation that was much more spiritually interested. The younger generation wasn't. So this is a pattern which reverses back and forth over time in American history. During periods of awakening, the focus is all on salvation by faith. In other words, look inside to find that, genuine inside that conviction, and that's how you save yourself. During crisis eras, the emphasis is much more on salvation by works. You've got to do things, build deeds, express your charity by actually helping other people, making their lives better. Do you see the difference in orientation? One is worldly focused, the other is internal focused. And I think today we see that difference between boomers, who have always been, an awakening generation. They're always focused inside. And millennials, who are not terribly interested in spiritual curiosity. I think this is part of a long pattern. What's interesting now, though, is that, and this is fascinating, is that religion increasingly is being determined by your party, by your political loyalties. Right. The recent finding came out, you probably noticed that the evangelicals are even higher now as a share of the population than they were when Trump was elected, right? And people wanted to scratch their heads thinking, wait a second, people are going to church less than ever. And we have all of this other data show that there's just less interest, right, in going to church. And it found out that increasingly evangelicals don't go to church. They just think of themselves as evangelical because that's part of what the red zone, the red zone political ideology is. You're evangelical. So it's fascinating. I actually do think that blue zone people who say they never go to church anymore or have no connection with any denomination, that too is being influenced by their ideology. I don't think actually their actual church-going behavior or religious behavior has actually changed very much. But I think it says a lot about how they want to identify themselves politically. So you see the interesting shift is in a crisis era, it's your politics that determines how you're going to categorize yourself in religion.
Yeah. And then I wonder with Facebook and with Twitter, they're just creating this echo chamber because obviously they want the eyeballs. They want people to stay online on their platform as long as possible. So they're giving you information that you know that you will respond to. And usually that's information that kind of gives you that confirmation bias.
Right.
So does that entrench this this belief system to a greater degree than what we've seen in the past?
Totally. As you know, confirmation bias is a positive feedback system. And what happens in a group of people who think alike, it's the more extreme views which tend to dominate, right? I mean, there's a natural kind of gravitation, right, toward that, in that direction. But I think everyone thinks it's the technology that's causing that. I really don't think so. I think that's true in all of these periods. People band together among people who think the same way. That's been true in revolutionary cells. That's true in party politics. And keep in mind that actually during the 19th century, it was taken for granted that newspapers reflected the position of a political party. There was no such thing as objective journalism back then. I mean, if you want examples of partisan journalism, go back to how newspapers are reacting to the election of Abraham Lincoln. You know what I mean? Or John Brown's raid, or what happened during the Civil War. I mean, it was all partisan. Every newspaper was partisan. No one had a pretense of objectivity. But people did pick up the news. You know, people did have it pretty good. Never underestimate the common sense of people. They do have a pretty good way of picking up what's actually going on. During the 1930s, when FDR was, accused by the Republicans of being, that man, Franklin Stalino Roosevelt, as he was called. But during that period, most of the editorial pages of America were Republican, not Democratic. Most of the news, official news that people was hearing, they didn't like. And a little bit like Donald Trump, what did he do? He found a new medium, the radio, the fireside chat. Well, that was a game changer. He went on every week, spoke person to person with the average American on the radio. A little bit like Trump and his tweets, right? So think about it. Leaders figure out how to get around that, and they figure out their own ways of connecting. And I think that on the long scale of history, people are able to put everything together pretty well. Right. And I think probably today as well.
Yeah, when you're saying that, I was just thinking about Trump coming out with that new social media platform. And this whole network, he took it public through a SPAC. I don't know if he's just involved with his name alone or if he owns it, or that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But it definitely ties into what you're saying. How do you think? I mean, I want to go back to this, the fourth turning, especially in the United States, always resulting in a war, unfortunately. And I'm just trying to figure out, okay, this seems like the direction we're going, but is there a way to get off, or what would be the best case scenario? Could we have a soft landing? I mean, I know it gets bad before it gets worse, but is there a way to have a soft landing?
I will say, not only do we have wars, we have total wars, right? So in other words, we have wars all the time in American history. And, historically, we've been always fighting someone. I mean, Americans are pretty violent people. We're fighting the Indians. I mean, we're doing something, right? But the total wars have come during fourth turnings. The American Revolution, we mustered everything we had. I mean, that was a war of survival. Obviously, the Patriots figured that they would be treated as traitors if they lost, and what would happen to them. The Civil War was about as total a war as you can imagine in terms of total casualties, right? If one side or the other had been able to invent a weapon of mass destruction, in 1863, would they have used it? Well, I think you know what the answer is, right? And in fact, in the early 1940s, America recruited willingly all of its best and brightest scientists to work 24/7 to invent and deploy a weapon of mass destruction, right? Which was used. So this is the mood, right? This is where you go in these periods. Is it necessary? I really don't know. There was a great essay. I mean, if people want an extraordinarily profound reflection on that, was William James, who delivered an essay in Stanford at 1906 called "The Moral Equivalent of War," and he asked exactly that question. He said that periodically it seems as though nations have to have war to actually bring the country, to inculcate these civic habits again, because we see it happening repeatedly. And he says, can we replace it? I mean, he was asking that question, back then. And he proposed various things. He says, maybe we should have a draft of young people and actually put them in camps. You know what I mean? To actually sort of foster the sense of surrendering your private interest to the public good, right? I mean, is there a way could we do this artificially?
It seems like they're already doing it in Australia.
Well, good luck. I mean, those Australians, they're a pretty libertarian crowd.
Well, I'm just referring to, they've had their issues with lockdowns there, quite extensive lockdowns in New South Wales. Hopefully they're coming out of there. I think James had something else in mind. It wasn't just passively accepting government doing things to you. Okay.
It was having the younger generation participate in something, like a war, but it would be nonviolent, right? I mean, we'd all go out. It's kind of the idea of Vista or Peace Corps. I mean, you kind of
go through boot camp.
Right. Go through boot camp, have to share something with people of other backgrounds, of other classes. Wealth means nothing, right? Your family background means nothing. You become a civic person for a while, right? And this is what we've been accustomed to occasionally in American history, of these entire generations that are simply accustomed to that, right? And they create this much more solid community as we come out. So anyway, he talks about that. And and it's interesting because somewhere in the essay, he asked the question, would most Americans in 1906, would they willingly, would they have preferred that the Civil War never happened? I find that a fascinating question. In other words, would we wish to be Americans today in 1906 without the Civil War ever having happened? And he answered his own question. He said, almost no one would want that, right? Everyone thought that the war, as horrible as it was, led to a much better country, right? We were united. We actually could have industrialization. We were kind of a united nation again, right? And he said, then he asked the question, would anyone wish this to happen in the future, an event like this? He said almost every American would say no. Right? So the way we look upon these events is very much the way we look at traumas in our personal life, right? Very often we're very happy to have had them because we grow, we become more mature. You know what I mean? We actually become a better person, but no one wants to go through another one, right? Isn't that the fact? So this is sort of what happens. I don't know whether it requires that kind of experience. It does require something that imposes a real sense of urgency on the public so that they actually have to shift out of whatever system they're in and rebuild largely from scratch, a new kind of system, which we do during these eras. And one way I like to say that even though this time of total crisis, total urgency, and the possibility of total war sounds apocalyptic to many people, I sometimes ask people, imagine this though, George, imagine everything on their current trend, right? In other words, greater inequality, greater fragmentation, greater loneliness, greater disconnection, greater, right? Just everything that we see today on into the indefinite future.
Right, right.
Is that a better future? I mean, I just posed that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. At some point, people draw their line in the sand and they say, no, we're kind of tired of this.
Yeah, you get to a point where you're backed up into a corner and there just are no good options. You've got to take the least bad option.
Exactly, which is why, when you ever look and dissect large wars, it always comes down to that. No one actually wants to be there. But of course, given where you are at the time, it seems like you have few other options. It's a little bit, there's an old Persian proverb which says something to the effect that, war at the beginning doesn't look as bad as peace at the end.
All right.
Which is one way of getting at that.
Yeah, I want to go over a couple things that have happened throughout American history, and then maybe we can view them through the lens of demographics and these cycles that you're talking about, to see if maybe these cycles had an impact on what came to fruition. The first thing is the Federal Reserve in 1913. It's just, I go back and I kind of am a geek when it comes to the banking system and whatnot. And I see that we had, that was the third central bank we had. And after the second one, we went into a system called free banking prior to the Civil War, where the banks were just issuing their own currency. It was very, prior to recording, when we were talking about Generation X, my generation, it seemed like a Generation X type of banking system. You know what I mean?
Absolutely was.
And then we went into the Civil War, where
a lot of counterfeiters, by the way, going around at that time.
Yeah,
it was free for all.
Yeah, it's kind of the wild, wild west, but it's that very libertarian, kind of don't tread on me, we'll do it ourselves. And then we had it more nationalized during the Civil War. And then the ultimate centralization, if you want to look at it that way, was in 1913, when we finally did agree on that third central bank, and it's been with us ever since. So how do you see that through the lens of cycles and demographics?
Well, it's again, community cohesion and centralization coming out of the crisis. I mean, we've seen that every single time. Remember, our first Bank of the United States was after the foundation of this country. And of course, Jefferson didn't like it, but he went along with it. All of that generation said, okay, that's okay. It's only during the era of Andrew Jackson, right, made a big issue out of that. The monster bank, what are they trying to enslave us all and give privileges to special people? That's always the Colorado Awakening, by the way. Certain people are being privileged, right, by the system, and so we leveled everything, and that was a period of the rise of this libertarianism that came into the next era, right, the 1840s and 1850s. Which was this period. And a number of states went completely bankrupt, obviously, during the 1840s. I mean, it was a wild period financially, clearly, in terms of, booms and busts, financial bubbles and busts. And with that, our national political system completely disintegrated, the Whigs and the Democrats. And of course, we went into a huge realignment of our national political parties and the birth of the Republican Party. And then we went into into the Civil War. But I do think that coming out of that, we had a more stable system, certainly. Among other things, we had the first kind of quantitative records. That's when Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, they actually begin to give the history and actually can monitor the quantities. And coming out of we had the Fed set up. Of course, the Fed didn't do much, after it was originally set up. It didn't do a heck of a lot during the 1920s, but it became much more instrumental during the 1930s and the Great Depression, particularly after
in the 1940s. In the 1940s,
particularly of the 30s, because Roosevelt took us off the gold standard, which created new creative possibilities for a fiat currency, obviously. And in the 1940s, And this is interesting too. We talk about these long-term periods and of sort of monetary trends. And when you look at the trend, we just celebrated, by the way, just at the end of September, the 40-year bond bull market, right?
Yeah, right.
The high point was September, I believe it was September 30th, 1981. And that was 15.84. That was the long-term, custom maturity treasury yield at that time, 15.84.
Right.
And it's been basically, that was the high point. It's been going down for 40 years. And people are trying to wonder, well, what's the new regime? As it can't continue to go down unless we're going to go very, very deeply negative. And I suggest that an interesting historical analogy, and we think about the trends over the last 40 years, right? Declining inflation expectations, declining interest rates, less regulation, and growing income inequality. I mean, that's basically, trends we've seen. Mm-hmm. If you look at the earlier 40 years, and that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
It's like a mirror image, right?
It is a mirror image. Guess when the long bond reached its all-time low before, the GFC?
Before the GFC, I would say the 1930s.
December of 1940. That was the low. That was 1.75. I considered low, but consider that inflation at that time was zero. We were still mired in the Great Depression. In fact, we went back into the recession of 37. And by 1940, our CPI was basically zero. There's no inflation. So 1.75 seemed pretty good, right? So that was the 10-year. Now, if you had invested in the 10-year on that, that would have been a horrible investment, right? Because what happened is that just a few months later, panicked by the Battle of Britain and the fall of France, Congress said, this is it. We got to start rearming. I mean, American public opinion is really shifting, right, on our need to prepare for war. So we started running huge deficits and started really rearming. That was the arsenal of democracy. By the end of 41, of course, we went to war. And over the next, several decades, right, it was huge bouts of inflation, probably larger than recorded because, price controls are never that effective. But you think of particularly the late 1940s, again, during the Korean War, and particularly in the late 1960s and 70s. So we had this enormous inflation. And up until 1951, with the Treasury Accord, with the Fed, the Fed agreed to simply be the lapdog of Treasury and keep rates, down to 2%. Yeah. Well, inflation was often going up at 15, 16, 17%. So you think of the trends over this period, right? Rising inflation expectations, declining real yields instead of large real yields like we've experienced over the past 40 years, more government spending, more regimentation of the economy, definitely more regulation, particularly during the big wars we had during that time, and growing equality, right? So the Gini coefficient reached its all-time low in the late 1970s. I mean, that's kind of when, we had the greatest equality. The middle class was strongest. And the very strength of the middle class is why boomers hated it so much. They still do today, by the way. Now, millennials, by contrast, love the middle class. They wonder where it is. How can I join it? Where is it? I'll sign up. I don't see it anywhere.
But what's interesting, everything that you said right there regarding what the government did to maybe that was the catalyst to this long-term inflation and the interest rates going up until the 1970s, it seems like we started to do in 2020 as our response to the pandemic, running these huge $5 trillion deficit that's being monetized by the Fed. And now we are seeing inflation go up, whether it's transitory or not, that's debatable. But if the inflation, and I always wonder, at what point is it not transitory? You know what I mean? Yeah, that's kind of a side joke for Powell, but you see what I'm saying there? Do you think we're doing the same things now that could lead to that catalyst like we saw in the 40s?
Yeah, the other thing that always amuses me is when they say, "Well, it's only a inability of supply to equal demand," as though that isn't always the problem with inflation.
Yeah,
right. I mean, that's the definition of inflation.
Right.
Anyway, I see two futures here. I do believe that this is the beginning of a long inflationary period. I do think, first of all, the Fed is going to have to, and that's going to be catastrophic, because at some point the Fed is going to have to, instead of being way behind. I think we have an extremely hot economy right now. It's not just the unemployment rate, but it's the quit rate that's so high, right? So the real unemployment of people who aren't quitting to get new jobs is practically vanishing. I mean, we've never had such low unemployment properly measured, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have an extremely hot economy right now. And what's going to happen is, at some point, with rising inflation expectations, at some point, the Fed is going to have to go from behind those expectations to ahead of it, right?
But do you think they just do a 1940s where they just kind of peg the curve and let this financial repression run its course to get the debt to GDP down to 60% or something? In
wartime, of course, you don't really have to worry about it, because you can always institute rationing and price controls. You just basically say, we're not even going to measure the numbers anymore. We're just basically going to tell you how much you could buy of anything, right? And you'll hugely stimulate. Now, the World War II was a huge equalizer in America, because not only did it take wealth away from all those people who owned all those bonds, right? So, that's happened to the wealthy people, but suddenly you're giving huge salaries in real terms to all of these workers who didn't used to have jobs or were unskilled. African Americans coming out of the South. One of the things that FDR did was guaranteed equal wages for federal projects for Black people for the first time. This is an enormous equalizer of incomes in America, right? And it was a great democratic moment. And late in the war, in 1944, he proclaimed, this new Bill of Rights with America, equality, many of these things having to do with sort of economic inequality, economic security. And it gave rise to a very different kind of consensus coming out of World War II, right? For the 1950s and 60s. I think, though, that what you're going to find coming up as we look ahead is that Jerome Powell is going to have to get ahead of the curve, right? So he's going to have to suddenly change ahead of it, because even if he will abide by, which is the point I'm going to get to in a second, I think he's perfectly comfortable with a much higher rate of inflation that we have, so long as it's stable.
Right.
But no central bank can allow accelerating inflation, right? I mean, that's just deadly, right? Because then all bets are off and the currency can plunge at any time. So he's going to have to change from being beneath it to ahead of it, right? And that's going to first go, involve moving from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. Then it's going to mean actually start raising the interest rates and all that.
Right.
And that's going to he's going to find that he's going to get actually surprisingly little purchase with his early decisions, and he's going to have to sort of accelerate those. So the near term, I'd say near to medium term effect of that will be a crash in nominal financial assets. I see no way around that, right? I mean, you see the value of all of these things that are denominated nominally.
Right. I
mean, that's going to have a big impact on markets generally. But it's certainly not anything I want to be long term right now. But longer term, George, I think that what you're going to see is no problem with abiding by a considerably higher inflation rate long term. For the same reason that it was okay with FDR. I think it was okay, in the early post-war era. And the reason is, consider all the problems that solves. First of all, it automatically brings down the federal debt as a share of GDP, right? It equalizes income because you're taking, wealth away from the haves and basically conferring it to the have-nots. Their debts aren't as big in real terms. So it does that. It keeps the economy running hot, right? To the extent that people's expectations of prices are always a little bit behind, how fast prices are rising. I don't know what else. Well, remember too that a third of our debt is owned by foreigners. Actually, a little bit more than a third. I mean, it's owned by sovereign wealth funds and I don't know, rich Saudis, and I mean, who cares about them? America first. America first monetary policy. What do you think about that? So, who's the loser there?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, we have this big spike in inflation. It continues to trend higher. Then Jerome Powell tries to be the Paul Volcker of our time.
Well, he's going to have to. But here's one other difference.
But then even if he does, though, inflation still, we get some disinflation, but it still continues to run at a rate of 5 or 6%.
Yeah, he will prevent it from accelerating. But I think after that, perfectly comfortable with it running at a much higher level. But there's one thing, too, that I think is going to cause a much more difficult crash in the adjustment to that. And that is because not only do you see the market impact of suddenly much higher inflation expectations, right? Being priced into bonds. But there's one other big thing that makes it very different from Volcker. And that is right now, if you look at the CBO's long-term projections, the CBO and every other long-term forecaster is pricing in very low interest rates for the next 30 years into their budget deficit projections. If those have to rise because suddenly bonds are much higher, if it goes up just 200 basis points or something, at 250 basis points, suddenly you have accelerating out of control deficits, which means that at that point, to prevent even a dollar devalue, loss of confidence around the world, the fiscal policy is going to have to turn to tightening, completely the opposite of today.
Right.
And this is the difference between Volcker, because when Volcker was tightening, and remember, Reagan gave him the green light. I mean, Carter brought him in, but then Reagan said, do your thing. If you don't want the quantity of money to grow, let interest rates do whatever they're going to do and do your thing. And of course, we did have a fairly serious recession in 1982, 1983. But Reagan was simultaneously able to run very large federal deficits to counteract that. Imagine how worse it would have been if Reagan had been tightening
the belt. Yeah.
Coming up, they may have to tighten the deficit at the same time. I mean, think of that, right? Because this is the point. You already have federal debt to GDP at historic highs, right? I mean, it's up at 105, 106% of GDP, right around where it was at the end of World War II. The only reason it's not going to grow for the next 10 years is that the CBO is projecting negative real interest rates, for the next 8 years. And then interest rates that are less than the nominal growth of GDP for over the next decade. Well, that is extraordinary. Now, if that suddenly goes the other way, again, this is going to be a fiscal game changer. At the same time, we're changing monetary policy.
Yeah, and when you're saying that, Neil, I'm thinking of so many whiteboard videos I've done recently where I'm really kind of trying to think through what the real economy is built on right now, because in a healthy economy, it's about creating goods and services, and that creates the consumption. You have to produce to consume. But now I just see this economy that is really dependent upon asset prices. And then to take it a step further, it's dependent upon that government deficit spending. So if you take away the asset prices, I always try to do a thought experiment with my audience and say, let's just assume we went into a Japan type mode in 1990, where the stock market goes down by 50%, the housing market goes down by 50%, and just stays there for the next 10 years. What do you think that does to aggregate demand in the United States? And then you combine that with what you're saying, with higher rates and the government having to tighten their belt and spend less. And that means a lower standard of living for quite some time.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I think that's where you'll see bigger government in other ways. Not the nice bigger government that everyone, both parties, pretending to complain, they both go along with it. I mean, let's say Democrats and Republicans are both fine with pandemic benefits and, 12.5% of GDP spent, raising in deficits the last couple of years. enormous amount of deficit spending because it was free. I mean, no one's really going to object to free money, right? So as polarized as the parties are, no one's going to complain if everyone wins and no one loses, right? And that was one. Of course, we all became wards of the state, the richest people, the poorest people. So, but imagine now where all the decisions are different. It's not about distributing benefits. It's about distributing pain. And what does that do with partisanship? I think you can imagine, right?
Well, give me an example. Can you give me an example of that, Neil?
Well, imagine if it's now, we have to have some combination of benefit cuts and tax increases. No one's going to get any more benefits.
See.
No one's, in other words, we're distributing pain. We're not right. So how does that work out? I think it makes it a much more hostile environment politically. And it also increases the likelihood that one party, if it attains dominance, becomes essentially a one-party government for a while, right? Just to try to make things work. All of the fourth turnings become, to some extent, one-party governments, simply because the public demands that. It demands someone to come in and actually just do what you have to do, right? That was the Democratic Party in the 1930s. That was the Republican Party, obviously, in the 1860s. And that was the Patriots. I mean, you can go back. I mean, there was always one group which becomes dominant because extreme public measures have to be taken. And I think that's a case where you could argue extreme measures would have to be taken, whether people like it or not.
Yeah, and then that maybe potentially gets you into that war type scenario that would be the conclusion of this fourth turning.
Yeah, and whether that's obviously you hate the scenario of having that be an eternal war, right? I'm always alarmed to see how many Americans today are in favor of secession. I mean, I don't know if you've been following those numbers, but they're scary now. They're still rising. After 2020, they're still rising, and not just among red zone states. I mean, because in blue zone states say, we could do so much more if we didn't have this weight around us, right, of these red zoners. Well, where is that going to go, right? I mean, seriously, I hate to even think about it.
Yeah. Well, you think that potentially leads to another civil war?
Well, that could, and then the problem is how realistically how would that work? I mean, if you don't have sort of the central, the regional centralization quite. I don't know what that would look like. It wouldn't look like the American Civil War. Maybe it'd be more like the Spanish Civil War, something where you have different regions, Well, I don't know. I hate to even imagine.
When I think that through, that's when I go back to the Revolutionary War and kind of that part of how they were referencing it, or how they're using the Civil War term, and how it's kind of that guerrilla warfare between the North and the South that you've talked about before. That's kind of, I see what is the highest probable outcome as far as how this would look in reality, because I don't think it's Texas, taking all their guns and trying to march up into Oklahoma or something like that. But it's maybe these dividing lines in the sand where you just kind of get these car bombs going off or these riots, looting.
Even in the Civil War, you had a civil war. I mean, not capital civil war, but you had civil wars, right? Within the Union. I mean, look at Eastern Tennessee, where you had this enormous guerrilla war between, pro-Union and pro-Confederate, people in the backcountry there. Look at Missouri, look at these places. Look at Maryland. There was a lot going on, right? In the Revolution, when the British suddenly decided, we've been too nice with you guys. They brought in a new general, General Clinton, and he just said, okay, now we're going to really, we mean business now. We're going to go into the South because we think we can get more support there. And they did have support. They had support, particularly in the backcountry colonists, the backcountry settlers, who hated the plantation owners, right? Who were the guys who were running everything and basically treating them as second-class citizens. They actually had a fairly strong base of Tory or Loyalist support in the backcountry. And so that's how they got there. They organized, loyalist units and so on. And it was an absolutely vicious guerrilla war in the South. And in addition, the British did something that Abraham Lincoln did later, and that is emancipate the slaves. So, I mean, he said emancipate the slaves. But you can imagine what that did to the plantation guys. That turned them even more solidly patriot. So eventually, not all of the plantation owners were totally on the side of the patriots, and it caused mayhem in the South. It was a terrible time. It was far more costly and violent ultimately than the war was in New England, and it led to perhaps the largest economic collapse in American history. Interesting research done on that. The most recent team of economists who've actually examined that period suggests that in the 1780s, by the end of the 1780s, mid to late 1780s, the GDP of America sank by maybe 30%, probably even worse than the Great Depression.
In nominal terms?
In real terms. I mean, nominally, who knows? I mean, the continental dollars. I mean, who even knew what was going on nominally? But in real terms, and what happened was, it wasn't just the violence and the guerrilla fighting. It was the fact that a very large share of America emigrated. You had an enormous set of Tories. I did the calculation recently. If we had the same amount of immigration today, the people who left, New York City, actually with the British in 1782, it would be the equivalent of 6-7 million Americans today. And remember, these tended to be the professionals. They tended to be the property owners and the professionals. These were people. They weren't necessarily the biggest wealth owners. They certainly weren't the planters, but these were generally the guys who actually were urban, new stuff. Were actually the financiers and so on. They're the capitalists, and they left. So here you have, this new United States, no political organization, no centralization, no national authority, with a completely cratered economy. Towns actually lost size. There was a de-urbanization of America during that period, right? People were going back to farming, who had left cities to go back to farming. So it was a very scary time.
But they're doing the same thing today. I can't tell you how many people I know that are thinking of or have already bought pieces of property out in the middle of nowhere that they're going to just go out there and
the turning away from market activity is a very interesting phenomenon, and we see it in crisis eras. And typically, what happens in the end of it, what we call a third turning, which is the pre-crisis era, we sometimes call that unraveling eras, right? Like the 1990s, early 00s, is that participation in the market economy reaches a fever pitch, right? Everyone wants to be paid for doing things, right? Everything is a transaction. It's sort of the market economy gone crazy. It's what I like to call the rise of the blow dryer economy. I pay you to blow dry my hair. You pay me to blow dry your hair. You know what I mean? And we're all eating out rather than fixing our food. And right. So we're having other people take care of our kids. Everyone's paying for everything else, right? What happens during fourth turning? This happened in the Great Depression. You're right. This happened during the Revolutionary period. Is that we go back to doing things outside of the market economy. We see that happening today. I mean, we see today the largest growth, most explosive growth in multi-generational households that we've seen since the 1930s.
Right.
Everyone today is living in these big households again. We see the regrowth of multi-generational families. Why do you think that single-family homes, particularly larger homes, are now so expensive? Everyone's moving back into them. People are coming back from nursing homes because they're dying there. But people are educating their kids now in their own home. They're working from their own home, and they've got more adults living there. The millennials never left home. They're still working from there. And people are beginning to do things for themselves within that household outside the market economy. Right. They don't have to pay each other. They don't have to pay taxes on their transaction. I mean, you just think of all the advantages, right? The efficiency advantages of just a more integrated social unit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, I think a hallmark of that was reached only about 2 years before the pandemic. I think it was 2018 or something, 2017, 2018, when for the first time, more Americans were eating out than buying food at grocery stores. And we have actually a guy at our team who actually tracks, restaurants. We often talk about that turnover. Well, that certainly isn't true anymore, is it? Right? People are back to, fixing their own food again, and looking after their own kids.
Yeah. So two things I want to go over just and look through the lens or look at it through the lens of demographics in these cycles. And then we'll let you go. I really appreciate your time. The first thing is, I remember seeing one of your animations on YouTube, and it talked about Gen Z. I believe that was the group they were started to come around in the early 2000s, and how they were kind of overly coddled, for lack of a better word, and how that could lead today to have a large push in our society to value safety, maybe a lot more than they value freedom. And that was number one. And then number two, I am just astonished at let's just call them bubbles that we see, or the hysteria, the mania that we see in things like NFTs or cryptocurrencies. I remember I did a story yesterday on Shibu or Shibi Uni or Una or whatever that joke of a joke cryptocurrency is now. Yesterday it got to over a $50 billion market cap. And I'm like, how can this possibly be happening? And maybe it has to do with these cycles. What do you think about those two things?
I think it's going to be a fairly short-lived cycle. I think that is a case of this boom unleashed by policy, right? Enormous deficits and enormous monetary easing, giving rise to this valuation.
Okay, so you think that's more fiscal and monetary policy as opposed to demographics?
Words, it's the whip end of that, right? Valuations are going crazy. You see this valuation expansion everywhere in all assets, right? And the riskier the asset, the bigger the growth. Well, you get into something like the Dogecoin and stuff. I mean, you're getting out there, and that stuff is just going crazy.
And Shibu Inu is a joke of Dogecoin, by the way. If you didn't know that.
There you go. You got a joke on a joke. But when valuations start compressing, when it goes the other way, it goes just as fast down. That's my take on it.
Okay.
And
then what about with Gen Z? Valuing safety a little bit more because they were maybe coddled.
Question about that, and that's actually a fundamental generational trend. I usually call them Homelander generation instead of Gen Z. I mean, I hate the idea of just another letter, Yeah. But we think that this younger generation, we date them a little later than Pew Research does. I mean, we think that these are kids who were born only a few years before the GFC. Okay. So they're still in grade school today. They're maybe entering high school today. Millennials, we think, is going to be a generation about 22, 23 years long. There's always a tendency, by the way, of social commentators to cut the most recent generation short because they want to talk about something else. So you always have these PR firms saying, well, I saw this with Generation X. I've seen this with so many mini generations crop up, over the past 25 years. But the larger insight is correct. This generation is going to be sheltered. They're at home. And one of the reasons I call them Homelander is not just because of the Department of Homeland Security, right, and all this new concern about protecting America, but also they're literally at home more than any other generation in American history. They are very protected. They're very rule bound, and they're very much interested in pleasing adults and getting along with older people. The idea of raging against the system or bucking authority is really not what they're about. As I think people who I have these kids at home, by the way, I know So that's not what they're about. That's not what their culture is about. And I think that the absolute parallel to this generation is the silent generation, born in the late 1920s, 1930s, early 1940s, who were children during the Great Depression and World War II. They were very well socialized, very rule abiding. They came of age just after the GI generation. People started noticing them actually in the late 1940s, just after World War II. And the question was, these kids, what makes them different? Instead of wanting to, change the system, join the Communist Party, do huge things with American civic life and organize unions, conquer half the world like the GI generation. Their motto was, we don't want to change the system. We want to work within the system. Their first questions on job interviews is about pension plans. What about my 30-year handshake? And they dressed very conservatively. They were very cautious. There's a famous Time magazine essay written about them in 1951, calling them the silent generation, how they were seem middle-aged even as young adults, right? In other words, very much. And the reason actually they got the name silent was during the McCarthy era, when older people were tearing each other's reputation for what they did during the 30s. Were you a communist? Were you not a communist? They kept their mouths shut because we had nothing on our records, right? They didn't want anything to get on their permanent record, right? That's how risk averse they were. And that really is, and interestingly, because we're such a gerontocracy today, we have such older people still in power. We actually have members of the silent generation at very high levels of authority, right? Nancy Pelosi being one, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden. Joe Biden was born in 1942. He personally recalls World War II. How many people? By definition, a boomer just has no personal recollection of World War II. It's almost how you define a boomer, right? I mean, they were raised after it was over, So this is interesting, isn't it? And what do you think of Biden? He's sort of like the Mr. Rogers of politics. He's sort of, very easygoing. I think everyone can compromise. We can always bring everyone, low key, definitely believes in consensus and process. And that's been their, trademark throughout much of their lives. It's a fascinating generation, actually, because in many ways they foreshadowed some of the boomer trends because they got tired of a lot of that early conformity. Yeah. But I think later in their life, they've always represented a fairly risk-averse, process-oriented generation. And interestingly, in American leadership, they've had almost no participation. Think about this. Of that entire generation, Biden is the first member of that generation to be elected president. We completely leapfrogged them. We went from, George Herbert Walker Bush
to Obama,
who was a World War II veteran, to Bill Clinton, who was born after World War II. And we completely leapfrogged them, and we've never gone back. Joe Biden was their last possible candidate, and he won. And that will be the little asterisk on the silent having no president. That will be their one president, right? So it's interesting. These are what we call politically recessive generations. By the way, another politically recessive generation is sort of the opposite end of the saculum, and that's Generation X. I mean, Generation X is politically very slow to appear politically. And the reason is because none of them trust the system. None of them really want to have any, the Xer motto in life is to stay off the system's radar screen. The last thing I want to do is to actually have a big visibility and taking responsibility for leading it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Neil. I have no idea what you're talking about. From a guy who runs a podcast called the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Exactly. I wonder where I got that idea. Right, exactly. So,
I would be Gen X, yeah.
So, but it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Gen Xers were amazingly, other than Barack Obama, who was very much at the early, and many people wouldn't define him as a Gen Xer, born in 1961. But other than him, the first Xer candidates even to run for the presidency in the primary was not until 2016. it's unbelievably late in a generation, right? To be even running for the presidency. They've been very slow to become state governors, senators, legislatures. And as a result, national government is still run by boomers. Gen Xers are just deciding, no, we want to do, I don't know, tech startups. We want to get on the marketplace. We want to listen to you and do other things with our life, right? But the whole idea of being responsible for our civic life, for, the entire community, not terribly appealing to Gen X. Much more appealing, by the way, to millennials. And of course, we will see that appear in time.
Yeah. Neil, what's your next book about?
It's going to be really about this process, but we're going to, the last book, everything were forecasted. I mean, it was way in the future. We kind of said that there was going to be a crisis starting sometime in the first decade of the 21st century. I think we kind of had that with 2008. And we kind of, made long-term forecasts of what the era was like. I think now that we're in it, I'm basically expanding my view about where we've been, my further thoughts about the historical process, as well as a much more concrete view of where we are and what's possible in the next climactic decade. Because typically what happens in these crisis eras is things speed up as you move toward the end, right? We've seen that repeatedly. So that's what we're going to see. And that's
do you have a title and do you have a date that it might come out?
I don't have a title yet, but we have titles, but we haven't finalized one yet.
Sure.
And the date will be probably at the end of 2022. So I know that we have a number of readers who want it. So I sort of keeping them informed occasionally about that. But it's got a great, publisher, and it's good. It's going to be a fair, and everyone will, I guess, will hear about it. So
I can't wait, and I'm sure my audience is in the same boat. So for my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
I am the head of the managing director of demography at Hegemony Risk Management. I think you had Keith on.
Yeah, I've talked to Keith a couple times. Yeah.
So Keith is, he heads the macro. He's our CEO. But I run our little team, and we do demographic trends. A lot of what I do is just the day-to-day stuff. I mean, I'm looking at, fertility, mortality, migration, all that kind of stuff, and as well as opinion trends. But I do like to occasionally weave in my own sort of generational perspective into that. And, that's our way of following markets from a somewhat different perspective.
Yeah. Well, Neil, again, I appreciate your time. I really can't wait to have another conversation. Thank you again.
All right. You're welcome.
Hi, guys. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the next Rebel Capitalist Live event. If you are a fan of the Rebel Capitalist show, I guarantee you will love the live event. The next one is Houston, where you can meet and listen to speakers, all your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist show. People such as Dr. Ron Paul, Chris Cole, Lynn Alden, just to name a few. If you want to check out the rest of the speaker list and find out how you can attend, we'll put a link in the description below, or you can just go to rebelcapitalistlive.com. This is an event where you can learn to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. But it's not just about building wealth. It's about increasing your freedom and networking with like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's an amazing event. I know you'll absolutely love it. Check out rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Houston.